Good evening, everyone. My name is Jan Bensley, and I've been asked to talk to you about the Loddon Parish Study, which was, and to some extent continues to be, a community-based local history project. Loddon is situated about 12 miles south of Norwich. The main roads through the village, the High Street, Bridge Street, run roughly north-south, with Marketplace and Church Plain with the car park, perhaps once called the Fairstead, to the east. It's a little over 10 years ago that ideas for a community project were first discussed. The aim of the project was simply to build on the knowledge already accrued, to create a greater understanding of the history of Loddon and appreciation for the heritage surrounding us. And most importantly, providing health and safety allowed, any activities required to carry out this further research would be open to all. Anyone who volunteered could try their hand at one or more, so that ultimately local people would acquire some of the skills required to investigate and contribute to their own local heritage, and that all information compiled would eventually be freely and easily available. Fortunately, the history group archive housed in the Loddon Library was already quite substantial. During the 1990s, Christina Crease and Carol Carpenter set up a local history exhibition in the priest's room above the porch of Holy Trinity Church. If any of you ventured up the stairs to this space, you may well have seen the information boards they produced and the section drawings of Bugden House. Such was their enthusiasm and interest generated that they continued to gather information. They were given permission to use a room in the library where they installed folders for documentary evidence and a computer to show images, and it was open for all to view. In the early 2000s, they founded the Loddon District Local History Group. By 2011, ideas were being exchanged between the committee on how the group's activities could be expanded on. We thought it would be nice to offer people, not just members of the group, an opportunity to take a more active, involved role in discovering more about their past. After some consideration, we chose activities in which some of us had an interest, some experience, or some training. We thought the main components would be archaeological test pits, which we suspected would spark the most interest. We needed to include activities that youngsters could join in too, documentary research, building history reports, particularly including non-residential outbuildings, maps and place names, and possibly, a little bit more ambitious, geophysical surveys and tree ring dating if the funding allowed, and field walking. We knew we would need help. We would have to call the experts in. In some instances, we'd be searching for evidence, and in others, recording it before it disappeared. We just hoped people would be interested enough and want to volunteer. Actually, we never did get round to the field walking, but perhaps at the time it was not quite so important for meeting our objective. Over the years, quite a bit of investigation and recording has been carried out in the surrounding area, from Alan Davison's in-depth analysis to recent metal detecting finds recorded on the Norfolk Heritage Explorer website. In the centre of the village too, certain buildings had often attracted attention. Information on many buildings are already on the Explorer and Historic England websites. In fact, most structures in the centre of Loddon are listed, but not all, and it appears some entries have been based on what can be seen from the outside of the buildings only, and unless building work is carried out, archaeological investigation does not take place in back gardens. It was these overlooked areas that interested us. It's been said our project was the archaeology of hidden places. Perhaps it was. 2012 became our pilot year, with encouragement and support from Norfolk community archaeologist Dr. Richard Hoggett and his assistant Chris Kolonko. We advertised a test pit training session to take place behind the Hollies in the High Street. And a group of people turned up. More out of curiosity, I think, than actually wanting to join in. But before long, medieval potsherds started to appear, and people around us were shaking sieves and emptying buckets. Adhering strictly to the protocol that Norfolk Historic Environment Service provided, another 12 pits were excavated that year. Finds from the pits were cleaned, dried, sorted by type of material, counted and weighed. Pottery and flints or unusual metalwork were sent to Gresson Hall for identification. Of course, not every pit contained something of interest, but a good amount of them did, certainly enough to keep interest going, and form a basis for the consistency of material that would appear. An application was made to the Heritage Lottery Fund, which was successful, and the 3-year £9,900 Heritage Lottery grant-funded parish study officially began in 2013. Large durable boxes were purchased, each containing everything needed to excavate a pit, from tarpaulins and trowels to find bags and chalk, so everything was ready for the volunteers to use. There were 66 volunteers on the list of the official report for 2016. More have taken part since, and when the 3 years were up, 57 pits had been dug and recorded, but it's nearer 80 now. We rather suspect that test pits can be dug because you are unlikely to cause too much damage or find anything particularly significant in a metre square hole, but if you excavate enough pits, a pattern starts to develop. These maps indicating find spots are from the final report submitted to HLF. We found some, but not many, Roman finds approximate to the main road through the village, although quite a few prehistoric finds came up in the lower end of Bridge Street, nearer to the river. Quite a lot of Thetford ware appeared, as you can see here on the right, but we were told that we had found enough Ipswich ware to suggest the settlement was Middle rather than later Saxon, as was originally thought. As expected, there was a lot more later medieval potsherds. And we caused quite a stir when we excavated some Beaker people pot too. And for example, there were these two pits marked in yellow, one in the garden of an early 19th century cottage on Low Bungay Road, and another in the front garden of a mid-20th century bungalow on Norton Road. The earlier references and maps we found only indicated these areas as being farmland or garden. When we went to view the site, we could see bits of grey ware and semi-glazed green medieval potsherds in the topsoil of the cottage garden, and the same appeared just under the turf of the bungalow. Though out of context, both pits contained a significant amount of medieval and late medieval pottery, with very little else other than that contemporary to the existing buildings. Is this enough to indicate areas of settlement? Well, perhaps. The pits are on opposite side of the land that slopes down towards the beck. At one time this was a larger waterway, a subsidiary of the Chet that still winds its way through the eastern side of the village and under the A146. As it is in many other places, remnants of older buildings hide behind Georgian, Victorian or later frontages. Sitting on the marketplace behind the more familiar houses that face Church Plain is Norfolk Cottage. It's a case in point, a hidden gem, and the owner very kindly allowed us to use it for another training session. So with help from the building group, I'm sure you'll recognise Ian and Claire Bradshaw, who had taken over from Richard Hoggett as community archaeologist. The building was measured, photographed, a written description was made, and all forms as requested by the Heritage Environment Service were filled in. During a later visit, accompanied by Sue and Michael Brown from the building group, Michael said this house was such a treat. It was a semi-detached property already divided in two on the tithe map. Norfolk Cottage is on the east side with the porch. Further discussion led to the conclusion that Norfolk Cottage had been part of a single-storey building, an open hall, the upper floor added in the 18th century. There are timber bones above the fireplaces, and a once outside wall on the north side of the living room still remains a mullioned window with 3 battens and string still attached, which Grasson Hall confirmed was for securing wattles and had been exposed, left on show as interesting features when the building was renovated in the mid-20th century. The new roof and bay windows probably arrived at the same time. We had initially intended to do a more in-depth investigation of just a few buildings, considering it was originally just a 3-year programme, and I'm sure everyone listening is aware of how long these things can take. But this was a community project. A few people were interested in doing this, but most people wanted to know who lived there, what was their occupation, and what was its purpose. Everyone, it seems, wanted to know how old something was, but really it was all about the social history aspect. What was life like in the past, in the place they now live? And when it became known we were interested in recording interior features before they were lost, people invited us into their house and outbuildings because there was something we might like to see. A couple of brief examples would be, firstly, this outbuilding, which is on Bridge Street, used for storage by the Seed and Garden Shop. It's not on the tithe map, but does appear on the later Ordnance Survey map. It is hardly unusual to find fixtures and fittings left inside outbuildings or being used for another purpose. But we could see why we'd been invited in, and quite surprised to see just how many fixtures had survived in situ. Everything needed for stabling horses, with harness hooks still on the wall, were there, among the paint pots and the wheelbarrows. The interior remained almost intact. Actually, the block of buildings with the garden centre shopping was once the Jolly Farmers pub. The only thing remaining to indicate this is what's left of the tall post for the pub sign in the centre of the image, which no one notices. The outbuildings were constructed for George Barnes, innkeeper and carrier, from 1879 to 1883. And while nothing remains of Black Smock Mill that once stood at the top of the High Street, underneath the front of the fish and chip shop, an 18th century building just a few yards along from Mill Loke, bit of a clue there, the owner showed us 3 large bread ovens. Its distinctive Norfolk boat-shaped cap appears quite prominent in the landscape in this Cotman print. Later known as Chapman's Flour Mill, the Chapmans were millers and bakers. It was converted to steam and demolished around 1891. However, if we were invited in because a building was being refurbished, we might only get a quick look. In that case, we just recorded what we could. Select Meat's butcher's shop occupied a premises that once belonged to the owner of the house next door, to which it's joined, situated near the High Street and Church Plain. The original owner, a butcher, Mr. William Lamb, was resident there in the early 1800s. Yes, that really was his name. We had 2 generations of Lamb the butchers. We'd all seen the huge iron rail, once used for hanging meat, that was still suspended from the ceiling, but now empty, at the back of this Georgian shop, behind the light-coloured chipboard partition, hope you can see that, we were able to look up into the upper story, where an earlier timber frame had been exposed. We were trying to decide if this was more or less in line with the frontage of earlier houses in Church Plain, which were set a little further back, and would like to have investigated this further, but while I could see studs still in place above, I couldn't see any in the lower section, or in fact anything that was actually holding it up. A little later, the partition had gone and a scaffolding post was being used for support. But we could not interrupt the building work. They were having enough problems. And unfortunately, we think this run of buildings may have been copyhold to the manor of Loddon Inglos, and there doesn't seem to be an existing court roll. But it wouldn't be the first time a clue to the history of a building turned up, completely unexpectedly, in a document or a neighbouring property. The case is still open. We know the Sutton family were there during the later 19th century, and were still there in the middle of the 20th century before it became Select Meats. In case you were wondering, it's Smart Opticians now. Unfortunately, we weren't quick enough when it came to the Angel pub. During a refurbishment, decorators put thick paint and a smart light fitting over the collection of apotropaic marks above the fireplace. But you can't win them all. The owners of Baytree House on Church Plain said, "The builders are digging a hole in our kitchen floor. It's going to be about 1 metre deep. Would you like to come and sieve what comes out?" Well, of course we would, and we did. Don't think the builders had had this happen before, but we kept out of their way in the garden, and the medieval and late medieval pot and bits of Bellarmine jar from underneath the house have been recorded. Something that did not go according to plan was the tree ring dating. In 2016, dendrochronologist Ian Tyers, accompanied by Susan and Michael Brown, spent the day with us looking for suitable buildings to take samples from. Of the 9 buildings we had in mind, the 2 we thought would be perfect we couldn't get access to. and none of the rest had a suitable oak beam. A lot of timber frames in Loddon or Elm. But thanks to Michael and Susan's expertise, their full report was in the NHBG journal, it was concluded, among other things, that the ancient house seen here has a roof which dates to the Elizabethan period. It's constructed from ash, oak and elm, and it has a more unusual style of scribed carpenter's marks. Unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of those, but you may have seen some examples recently if you attended the building group AGM in the upper floor of the Fox at Garbaldersham. And another more unusual discovery was made in a farmhouse where the owners didn't want samples or photographs taken. It has an imported roof, possibly taken from an ecclesiastical building around the time of dissolution, with wide oak loft floorboards and a 15th century diamond mullioned window taken from an earlier house. Watch this space. Something that didn't go according to plan was the tree ring dating. In 2016, dendrochronologist Ian Tyers, accompanied by Susan and Michael Brown, spent the day with us looking for suitable beams to take samples from. Of the 9 buildings we had in mind, the 2 we thought would be most perfect we couldn't get access to. And of the rest, none had a suitable beam. A lot of timber frames in Loddon or Elm. But thanks to Michael and Susan's expertise, their full report was in the NHBG journal, it was concluded, among other things, that the ancient house, seen here, has a roof which dates to the Elizabethan period. It's constructed of ash, oak and elm. It has a more unusual style of scribed carpenter's marks. Unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of these marks, but you may have seen some examples recently if you attended the building group AGM in the upper floor of the Fox at Garbaldersham. And another more unusual discovery was in a farmhouse where the owners didn't want samples or photographs taken. It was an imported roof, possibly taken from an ecclesiastical building around the time of the dissolution, had wide oak loft floorboards and a 15th century diamond mullioned window from an earlier house. Watch this space. Document research is not so inclusive, but a team of volunteers have put countless hours into sorting and transcribing relevant inventories, court rolls, church warden and overseers' accounts, parish registers and maps, to name but a few. The Record Office has and continues to be very supportive. But of course, we were looking for material that was not listed on a catalogue, and we weren't disappointed. Deeds and various other papers in boxes and carrier bags were unearthed from lofts and cubbyholes and generously loaned to us. Such documents may not give a detailed insight into daily life, but they provide a link. We could locate people to places. They provided details of abutments and adjoining premises. In fact, the deeds were particularly useful. It seems a large number of buildings in Loddon became freehold fairly quickly. It meant we could say to the owners of Lehman House, your property was built in 1810, owned and occupied by William Cole, attorney at law. But it was the personal details that mattered. So, we'd seen his signature on practically every conveyance from private houses to mills in the Loddon vicinity made during the later 18th and early 19th century. But in 1829, our William Cole disappeared from the records. It was by chance a newspaper entry was spotted. It was an insolvency notice. Now we knew where to look. Most days at work I had walked through the area in Norwich Castle, built to be a prison, and where our William would have resided as a debtor. He was in debt for about £600, and by then an elderly widower. Doctor's notes and his letters to the prison governor still survive. They seem to have been quite fond of him. Debtors could sometimes leave the prison, but he chose not to. Unusual for a burial entry, St John's Timber Hill Register includes the detail that he never left during the 16 years he was there. So his story was included in the display of prison life in the Castle Keep basement. I wonder if he'll be included again after the present renovations have finished. However, all of this was amounting to a lot of information. Eager to meet one of our main objectives, we had already begun sharing the information we had gathered. To do this, firstly at a local level, After the archaeological finds had been officially identified, they were displayed and a parish study progress report was given at annual meetings. The reports were emailed to everyone who couldn't attend but expressed an interest. Talks on what had been discovered in the documents and images from the growing photographic collection were very popular. Besides downloading data, the information gathered on some buildings was collated into folders. 3 copies were made, the first one given to the owner of the property, another was sent to Gresson Hall, and one was made available to view in the archive in the library. This included documentary evidence of the property and residents, entered onto spreadsheets and laid out in chronological order. This is the folder for Norfolk Cottage. I hope you can see the earliest document to provide a name for this building was a lease, revealing before 1750 it was commonly known as the Angel. There is a pub in Loddon today called the Angel, but that used to be the White Lion. This was one we didn't know about. The earliest recorded occupier was Widow Long, Charity Long her name was. Now we had a name, we could find her in other documents. She appears slightly earlier in 1745 and 46 in the overseer's accounts, being supplied with crutches and a shilling for firewood. The Crisp family from Chedgrave owned the property for the second half of the 18th century, so perhaps they inserted that ceiling. When more information or photographs were discovered, they were added to the folders. And of all the things we did, these simple folders proved very popular. And speaking of simple ideas, although there is quite a lot of work involved in maintaining them, in this age of advanced communication, the churchyard plaques have probably been read by more people than anything else. Residents and tourists constantly pass through the churchyard. There are pathways that lead to Beccles Road and the road that leads to Pies Mill, a mooring and picnic area from the centre of the village. Ploughing through the documents, Elvie came across many interesting stories about the lives and achievements of past residents and decided she would share them. There are small plaques telling these stories all over the churchyard and a few in other places too. On the left, next to the headstone of Henry Burroughs, is his story. He died in 1706. He was a grocer and tallow chandler who produced his own trade tokens and lived in the Pink House on Church Plain. A little further along is the tomb of Robert Pedgift, Loddon surgeon. He too resided in the Pink House. 2 other occupants are also buried not far away. As you can see, there is a picture of the Pink House on the plaques, and you can see the building from the churchyard. In some instances, you can trace who lived where by wandering round the headstones. When it came to disseminating our results further afield, our archaeological finds are already recorded and accessible on Heritage Explorer website. Although regrettably the support we got from our community archaeologists was lost, the post was made redundant, and earlier this year we had to remove our archive from the library. They needed their room back. But we do have at the moment a community archivist, and fortunately we are part of their programme to record sources held by local groups. So volunteers have been re-indexing and entering a description of every item on our archive onto spreadsheets, so the catalogue will be accessible online. And before long, pandemic allowing, the archive will have a new permanent home too. A lot has happened during the last 10 years. In a few instances, we didn't find what we were hoping for, but in others, more than we expected. We were unable to get the geophysical equipment we wanted, and eventually hired equipment to carry out resistivity surveys. After some training, this was quite successful, although the site of Bacon's Manor House we're always hoping to locate remained elusive. The results of the field survey next to the marketplace, where it's possible the house once stood, were inconclusive. This is a converted barn on site. But the test pit did turn up possible signs of habitation, so we haven't given up hope. And we soon found out that obviously if you put a test put in where there's been continual habitation in a built-up area like the High Street, you just might get more than you bargained for. To make sure as many documents as possible would be preserved, some were returned to owners in archive boxes. while the parchments and papers in the solicitor's office that took hours of searching through were deposited in the record office. I don't know exactly how many were deposited, but there were 3 carloads at least. Most now are open to view and are already on the catalogue. Different people have contributed in different ways, and people who had not met before formed groups and worked together. But there are still plenty of questions to be answered. This wall painting is in a house on Marketplace. The figures on the left look late 17th century, but the landscape is recorded on the Explorer site as probably a copy of Kirkpatrick's view of Norwich, published 1723. But not everyone agrees this is the same view. And who are the figures on the left? We're open to suggestions, still working on it. The latest project is to produce maps showing past ownership, boundaries, field names. Much larger and detailed versions than these will go on show in public places around the parish. So much more documentation, images, even tithe maps with apportionments are readable online now than when we first started. At the time, when it was said that we were short of aerial photographs of certain areas, the answer was, well, we'll have to go and get some. And we did. Handy if you have a local airfield, of course. So if you are thinking of embarking on a similar project, we in Loddon would simply ask, what are you waiting for? Thank you for listening.